Okay, give it a try now.
Hello. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Maynard Adams Symposium for the Humanities. And I'm very happy to welcome you here. This is the first ever session of the first ever Maynard Adams Symposium, and we are so glad you're here. Thank you. And this is a new event sponsored by Carolina Public Humanities to honor the longtime UNC philosophy professor, Maynard Adams, who was the founder of the program in the humanities and human values, and this was started in 1979. I'm Lloyd Kramer, and I am the director of the program in the humanities and a professor in the history department. And this week we are changing our name to become Carolina Public Humanities. And this program is the first ever celebration of our new identity. But a rose by any other name is still a rose. So our mission at Carolina Public Humanities is to serve as a bridge between UNC's faculty and the people of North Carolina, including teachers in K-12 education. And this new symposium has been made possible because of the generous support of Crawford Taylor and all of his family who are here with us today. Could you just stand up, Crawford, and say hi or wave? Crawford Taylor. And his wife Marlene, his son Logan, and his daughter Meryl. And we are also honored to have Jill Adams here. Jill is the daughter of Maynard Adams, and here she is as well. So we're very happy they're all here. And the Taylor Charitable Trust has also given us funding to create the first group of Adams graduate fellows who are also here. Would they just stand and wave to the crowd? These are the first ever College of Arts and Sciences, the Philosophy Department, the Center for Global Initiatives, and all of the other supporters who have helped to make this event possible, including the staff of Carolina Public Humanities. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you Chancellor Carol Folt, who will say a few words to greet us. She's here because she believes in the humanities, although she herself was trained as a biologist, aquatic biologist. But she is part of this event because she also supports the arts and humanities. And it's very appropriate that she's here to welcome Martha Nussbaum because Professor Nussbaum will be examining how emotions influence public and private life. And this is a theme that was very important to Maynard Adams. And to say a few more things about Professor Adams and this event, I'm very happy to honor and welcome Chancellor Carol Folt. Carol?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm loving all those firsts. You know, at Carolina, we make a big deal about number ones and firsts and all these fantastic events that happen here. But it is America's first public university. And I think it's very fitting and actually very meaning that we're having this symposium today in the Carolina Public Humanities. I think that goes together really well, and it's important to reinforce that at all times, but this is a fantastic event to be celebrating with everyone. In the preface to his seminal work, A Society Fit for Human Beings, Professor Maynard Adams wrote, "We must work our way through our modern culture, preserving what is good and right in our way of life, to some new stage of civilization that will make for human growth and the flourishing of the human spirit." That was 2 decades ago, and it's still as true as ever, maybe even more so today. Professor Adams' writings are very applicable today, and I think they might be of real comfort to us and direction to us in times that feel turbulent. In A Society Fit for Human Beings, which was published in 1997, he laid out the essentials of his philosophy, which was a synthesis that he called realistic humanism. One reviewer of Professor Adams' book and his life's work recently wrote, "There's so much of today's world value and importance in Professor Adams' philosophy," and then I'm underlining this, that, quote, "every student and responsible citizen should be aware of Professor Adams' writing." So it's wonderful for all of us to have a better look into that today. This is the opportunity that we're celebrating tonight to become more aware of his legacy and his philosophy, and at this and joining together at this address of the first E. Maynard Adams Symposium for the Humanities. This will, of course, become an annual event, and we're going to use it to encourage public discussion about key issues in the humanities, or I could maybe even rephrase that and perhaps say key issues for humanity. And I think it's very appropriate that this lecture is part of the Carolina's Human Heart Initiative that has been going on all year, and I think I've probably seen a number of you at different events that have been sponsored by that. Professor Adams had a profound impact at UNC and in our local communities. He joined the UNC faculty in 1949, retired from active teaching in 1990, but like many professors, he rose through the ranks, taking on many different roles here. He was the chair of the philosophy department in the 60s. He was a Keenan professor of philosophy after 1971. He was the chair of the faculty council in the mid to late 70s, and I just came from that meeting. Very strong faculty governance here. During the Vietnam era, he was the founding director of UNC's curriculum in peace, war, and defense. And I can't tell you how many students I continue to meet for whom that is their most important and telling experience while they're here at Carolina. He served as its director in the early 70s. He also supported the creation of the program in humanities and human values in the 70s, which is now the Carolina Public Humanities. He is probably one of the best examples of taking or getting out of what we do in the ivory tower and making it involved in the life that we live. So his work was very active in civil rights movement. He was a commentator on improving education in the South. Again, issues that are relevant today as ever. He was one of the founders of the Chapel Hill Community Action, Inc., and he addressed issues of segregation and poverty, and a program that was adopted as a nationwide model by the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity. Truly, I understand why he was so inspiring to you, an extraordinary individual. He and his wife of 61 years, Phyllis Stevenson Adams, lived their own lives of helping other people. And that, too, is at the core of what we think about here. Service in the public good is what I see every day living on our campus and in our community. And we're very honored to have Jill here today, and so I know we've just recognized you. It's great to see you here. And I want to repeat a little bit of Lloyd's thanks. This symposium wouldn't be here if it hadn't been due to a generous gift to help initiate this wonderful program by Crawford and Marlene Taylor, and also the family to be here. I just want to say that when faculty spend their lives teaching and doing their research, you know, they don't do it with a goal in mind that they're going to be recognized. They do it because they love it. It's what they do, and clearly reading about him, there couldn't be a person more like that. But there is nothing more special than to know later that you touched the lives of your students and that things you did on a life well lived have had an influence, and as you're doing, taking that influence and making it possible for so many other people to celebrate that. So thank you so much for that. I also want to add that they are both Tar Heels. Crawford MA in 69 philosophy and Marlena BA in 69 in music. So I think that's wonderful having that Tar Heel legacy, and also supporting, as you heard, the Maynard Adams Fellows for all the students that are here. We're also so privileged to have this wonderful, wonderful speaker that Lloyd's going to introduce in a moment, Professor Nussbaum, to speak. And when he first told me about the event, before I knew as much about it, but I knew who the speaker was, I said, I really have to be there, because I've heard her speak before, and I've been so excited when I've heard her lecture. So it's a pleasure to be here. She traveled from Chicago to Carolina to be here, and so I'm now going to turn the program back over to Professor Kramer, thanking him for all that he does to introduce our featured speaker. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Folt. So our keynote speaker today, and this is the first part of a two-part symposium. It will continue tomorrow at the Center for School Leadership Development. But our keynote speaker today is Professor Martha Nussbaum, who is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. She received her PhD at Harvard University, which is something she shares with Maynard Adams. A little-known fact, but I'm bringing it to our attention. And she has taught at the University of Chicago since about 1995. Professor Nussbaum is a philosopher with exceptional international influence. She has published more than 20 books, including the very important work Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities in 2010, and Anger and Forgiveness, Resentment, Generosity, and Justice in 2016, which was published last year by Oxford and is part of the foundation for her talk today. And she is about to publish a new book entitled Aging Thoughtfully, which is a subject that is absolutely relevant for everybody in the room. Professor Nussbaum is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, and last year she received the Kyoto Prize in Thought and Ethics, which is awarded every 4 years and often called the Nobel Prize in Philosophy, the highest honor an international philosopher can receive. We're therefore extremely pleased to welcome Professor Nussbaum as the keynote speaker for this first Adams Symposium, and the title of her talk is Transforming Anger into Justice, Gandhi, King, and Mandela. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nussbaum.
Well, I can't tell you what an honor and pleasure it is to be invited to be the inaugural speaker in this wonderful program. It is just a tremendous pleasure for me, partly because I have a long history of good memories of Chapel Hill. In fact, my daughter was in effect born in Chapel Hill because I was pregnant while I was here, although she was born afterwards. But I've been here often. I do think it's certainly one of the best, if not the best, philosophy departments in the United States. And particularly strong in ethics. So it's a particular honor to be invited to be involved with the honor given to Maynard Adams, whose work was so broad and ventured into the public square in a way that I think is very important. So I, too, would like to thank everyone, Chancellor Folt, Crawford Taylor and all his family for making this occasion possible, and Lloyd Kramer, who's done such a wonderful job of organizing the whole thing. This lecture will be a distillation of some parts of my recent book, but in a way that will open up a number of different issues for discussion. So I hope we'll have questions today, but then tomorrow we'll have the wonderful and very challenging interventions of the six commentators. So I'll begin with a Greek tragedy, which I think sets our problem up very nicely. At the end of Aeschylus's Oresteia, two transformations take place in the archaic world of the characters. One of these is famous and the other often neglected. In the famous transformation, the goddess Athena introduces a court of law to replace and terminate the seemingly endless cycle of blood vengeance, setting up a court with established procedures of reasoned evidence and the giving of argument, and a jury selected by lot from all the citizens of Athens, she announces that from now on, homicide will be settled by law rather than by the Furies, the ancient goddesses of revenge. But, and this is part and parcel of her famous transformation, the Furies are not simply sent away. Instead, Athena offers them a place of honor beneath the earth, in recognition, she says, of their importance for these same institutions and the future health of the city. Now, typically, this move of Athena's is understood to be a recognition that the legal system must incorporate the dark retributive passions and honor them. So the suggestion is that the resentful passions themselves remain unaltered. They simply have a new house built around them. They agree to accept the constraints of law, but they retain an unchanged nature, dark and vindictive. That reading, however, ignores what I call the second transformation, which is a transformation in the nature and demeanor of the Furies themselves. At the outset of the drama, the Furies are repulsive and horrifying. They're said to be black, disgusting, their eyes drip a hideous liquid, and Apollo even says that they're vomiting up clots of blood that they've ingested from their prey. And he remarks that they don't belong in a democracy. They belong in some tyranny where it's customary to torture people and kill them arbitrarily. Nor, when they awaken, because in the beginning they're lying asleep on the ground, do the Furies give the lie to these grim descriptions. As the ghost of the murdered Clytemnestra calls upon them, they don't even speak, but they simply moan and whine, making animal noises. In the Greek, you have the words rygmos and oigmos. So these are animal noises. When they do start to speak a little bit later, their only words are, get him, get him, get him, get him, get him, as close to a predator's hunting cry as the genre allows. As Clytemnestra says, in your dream you pursue your prey and you bark like a hunting dog hot on the trail of blood. If the Furies are later given poetic speech, as of course the genre requires, we're never supposed to forget this initial characterization. What Aeschylus has done here is to depict unbridled resentment. It is obsessive, destructive, existing only to inflict pain and ill. As the distinguished 18th century philosopher Bishop Butler observes much later, no other principle or passion hath for its end the misery of our fellow creatures. In its zeal for blood, it's not quite fully human, and Apollo's idea is that this rabid breed belongs somewhere else, in some society that doesn't try to moderate cruelty, and surely not in a civilized democracy. Unchanged, then, these Furies could not be part and parcel of a working legal system in a society committed to the rule of law. You don't put wild dogs in a cage and come out with justice. But the Furies don't, in fact, make the transition to democracy unchanged. Until quite late in the drama, they are still their bestial selves, threatening that they're going to disgorge their venom upon the land. But then, Athena persuades them to alter themselves so as to join her enterprise. Lull to repose the bitter force of your black wave of anger, she tells them. But of course, that means a very profound transformation. Indeed, a virtual change of identity, so bound up are they with anger's obsessive force. She offers them incentives to join the city, a place of honor, respect from the citizens, but the condition of this honor is that they become fully human, not totally taken up with revenge, but able to adopt a new range of sentiments, in particular, benevolent sentiments toward the entire city. They must also refrain from stirring up anger within the city. And the deal is that if they do good, and they have and express kindly sentiments, they will receive good treatment and be honored. Perhaps most fundamentally transformative of all, and certainly very crucial for our democracy too, they must listen to the voice of persuasion. All of this, needless to say, is not just external containment, it's a very profound inner reorientation. They accept Athena's offer, and they express themselves with gentle-tempered intent, using, in fact, the same word that Aristotle uses for the virtuous disposition in the area of anger. Each, they declare, should give generously to each in what they call a mindset of common love. Not surprisingly, they're transformed physically in related ways. They apparently assume an erect posture for the procession that concludes the drama, and they receive crimson robes from a group of citizen escorts. So they've become Athenian citizens rather than beasts. Their very name is changed. They're now called the Humanities, meaning the kindly ones rather than the Furies. This second transformation is just as significant as the first one, and indeed it's crucial to the success of the first one. Aeschylus is showing that political justice does not simply put a cage around resentment, it must fundamentally transform it from something barely human, obsessive, bloodthirsty, to something really human, accepting reason, calm, deliberate, and measured, something that protects life rather than threatening it. The indignation that inhabits just institutions is not an angry sentiment at all. It's a measured judgment in defense of life. The Furies are still needed because this is an imperfect world and there always will be crimes to be dealt with, but they are not wanted or needed in their original shape and form. Indeed, they just aren't their old selves at all. They've become instruments of justice and human welfare. The city is liberated from the scourge of vindictive anger, which produced civil strife and premature death, and in place of anger, the city gets forward-looking justice. It's no accident that the major Greco-Roman philosophers, from Socrates straight on through Seneca, were strong opponents of retributivism in the criminal law and defenders of a welfare-oriented, deterrent conception of punishment. Well, so that's a sketch of my normative idea, but it's radical and evokes strong opposition. For anger, with all its ugliness, is a very popular emotion, maybe even more popular than when I wrote this book in around 2014. Many people think it's impossible to care about justice without anger at injustice, and that anger should be encouraged as part of the revolutionary transformation. Many people also believe that it's impossible for individuals to stand up for their own self-respect and that of others without anger, that someone who reacts to wrongs and insults without anger is spineless and downtrodden. Women, in particular, have often been urged to tap into our own alleged hidden anger and to see this search for suppressed anger as part of a personal struggle for self-respect. Moreover, many people also believe that getting angry when someone else does something wrong to you is essential to taking that other person seriously. So if you wrong me and I don't get angry at you, I'm treating you condescendingly, like a child or a person who's not fully responsible. Nor are these ideas confined to the sphere of personal relations. The most popular position in the sphere of criminal justice today, certainly in the United States anyway, is retributivism. That is the view that the law ought to punish aggressors in a manner that embodies the spirit of justified anger. And it's also very widely believed that successful challenges against great injustice need the spirit of anger to make progress. Anger, then, is at the heart of revolutionary transformation. Still, we may persist in our skepticism by thinking about the fact that recent years have seen 3 noble and successful freedom movements, all conducted in a spirit of non-anger. Those of Mohandas Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King Jr. here, and Nelson Mandela, which is also here in that virtual sense. Surely, people who stood up for their own self-respect and that of others, and who did not acquiesce in injustice. I'll now argue that a close philosophical analysis of the emotion of anger can help us see how we might support these philosophies of non-anger, showing why anger is fatally flawed from a normative viewpoint, sometimes incoherent, and sometimes based on bad narcissistic values. In neither case is it of great value in life and in the law. So I'll first present the general view, and then I'll show its relevance to thinking about revolutionary justice. So let me begin with Aristotle's definition of anger, because it is seminal in the Western philosophical tradition. It's pretty much the template against which all subsequent Western philosophers define anger. And it turns out, as I've been able to find out, that Indian philosophy has very similar definitions of anger. That's the only non-Western tradition I know enough about to comment. But Aristotle says that anger is a painful emotion that responds to a significant damage to something or someone that one cares deeply about, and a damage that the angry person believes to have been wrongfully inflicted. He adds that although the anger itself is painful, it also contains inside itself a pleasant hope for payback or some sort of retribution. So, significant damage pertaining to one's own values or cares, and wrongfulness. Those two elements, I think, seem both true and pretty uncontroversial, and they've been validated by modern empirical psychological studies of the emotion. More controversial, perhaps, is the idea that the angry person wants some type of retribution, and that this is a conceptual part of what anger itself is. Now, in fact, all the Western philosophers who define anger do include this wish as a conceptual element in anger, but we had better pause because it's not obvious. Now, first, we ought to understand that this wish for retribution or payback can be a very subtle wish. The angry person doesn't need to wish to go out and take revenge herself. She may simply want the law to punish the aggressor, or even some type of divine justice. Or, even more subtly, she may simply want that wrongdoer's life to go very badly in the future, hoping, for example, that that second marriage of your betraying spouse turns out to be a dismal failure. Well, I think if we do understand the wish in this broad way, Aristotle's right. Anger does contain a kind of strike-back tendency, and that's what differentiates it from other painful emotions, such as compassionate grieving. Contemporary psychologists who study anger empirically agree with Aristotle in seeing this double movement in it, from pain inflicted to hope for payback. An example will help. Suppose that a wrongdoer has murdered Angela's child. She does, of course, feel enormous grief and loss. But suppose she's angry at the murderer, as of course she's very likely to be. What's that emotion all about? Now, it isn't just grief at the loss, because she focuses on the wrongfulness of the act. But still, is it just a kind of sadness or grief that a wrongful act has occurred and a wish that it had not occurred? If that's all Angela feels, then I think we wouldn't yet call her emotion anger. It would be a special species of grief. But then, what is it that makes her emotion anger? I think it is the wish for some type of payback, however subtle. Now, I'll return to this, and later I will introduce one major exception. But first, one more thing that Aristotle says is not quite right. He says that anger is always a response not to any old wrongful damage, but only to the sort that he calls a down-ranking. Now, I think that's not true all of the time. I can certainly get angry at wrongs done to other people or even to me without thinking of them as down-rankings of me, that is, status injuries. Still, let's hold on to Aristotle's idea because it does cover surprisingly many cases of anger, as empirical researchers discover and emphasize. And it can help us to make sense of some puzzling things we'll get to later. Well, now we're ready to begin to see what's conceptually and normatively problematic about anger. The central issue is this. The payback idea does not make sense. Ideas of cosmic balance are extremely widespread and archaic, and most of us have them at some level. When wrong is done, we somehow think that the universe will be off kilter unless there's a proportional rectification. The earliest written piece of Western philosophy, a fragment of the 6th century BCE philosopher Anaximander, says that human justice is like the cycle of the seasons. The hot and the cold pay penalty to one another, each by predominating for a while and then getting driven out in their turn. So that's something people believe, whether because of their experience of the seasons or some other deep-seated tendency. But it just doesn't make sense in the world of human action. Whatever the wrong was that was done, a murder, a rape, an assault, inflicting proportional pain on the wrongdoer does not help restore the thing that was lost. As Aeschylus says, when a man's blood is spilt upon the ground, who can call it back again? We think about payback a lot, and I think it's very human to think that proportionality between punishment and offense somehow makes good the offense, only it doesn't. Let's say my friend has been raped. I urgently want the offender to be arrested, convicted, and punished. But precisely what good will that do? Looking to the future, I might want many things: to repair my friend's life, to prevent and deter future rapes. But harsh treatment of that particular wrongdoer might or might not achieve the latter goal. It's an empirical question, as Plato, rejecting Anaximander's archaic idea of punishment, already saw. And usually, people do not treat it as an empirical matter. They're in the grip of an idea of cosmic fitness that makes them think blood for blood, pain for pain is the right way to go. The payback idea is deeply human, but fatally flawed as a way of making sense of the world. Now, I'll just mention an example from the book that actually isn't in the text of this talk, since it concerns a famous North Carolina alum. And that is, one time Michael Jordan was being interviewed about the murder of his father. And the broadcaster said, well, if they catch this man, don't you want him to die? And Jordan just looked rather puzzled. And he said, well, you know, that wouldn't bring him back. Now, I think that's my thought too, but I think it's only someone whose credentials of masculinity were so unimpeachable as Jordan, who could dare to say that on TV. But now we can return to Aristotle's idea of down ranking. For there's one, and I think only one situation, in which the payback idea does make perfect sense. And that is when I see the wrong as entirely and only a down ranking. That is entirely and only about relative status. So if the problem is not the murder or rape itself, but the way it has affected my relative status in the social hierarchy, then I really can achieve exactly what I want by humiliating the wrongdoer. By pushing him relatively lower, I do automatically push myself up relatively higher. And since status is all I care about, I don't need to worry that the real problems caused by the wrongful act have not been solved. In short, a wrong person who is really angry, seeking to strike back, soon arrives, I would say, at a fork in the road. 3 paths are open to her. First, she can go down what I would call the road of status, seeing the offense as all about herself and her relative rank. Or, second, she could choose the road of payback and imagine that the offender's suffering would actually restore the thing that was lost, a thought that doesn't make sense. Or, if she is rational, after exploring and rejecting these 2 flawed roads, she will notice that a 3rd path is open to her, which I think is the best of all. She can focus on doing whatever would make sense and be really helpful in that situation going forward. This may well include the punishment of the wrongdoer, but in a spirit that is forward-looking rather than merely retaliatory. But wait, first, what is really wrong with the status path? Many societies do encourage people to think of all injuries as basically about themselves and their own relative ranking. Life involves perpetual status anxiety, and more or less everything that happens to a person either raises one's rank or lowers it. Aristotle's society, as he depicts it, was to a large extent like that, and he was very critical of this tendency to be obsessed with status on the grounds that this focus on honor and status impedes the pursuit of intrinsic goods. The error involved in the status path is not easily dismissed or silly, nor should we think that the preoccupation with honor and status is found only in other societies, those that we sometimes disparagingly call honor cultures and locate somewhere far away from ourselves, like in the Middle East or something. No, this preoccupation is ubiquitous in our own country, and I would remind you that the wonderful, brilliant musical Hamilton is really all about that, about the role of the obsession with relative status at the founding of our own country. And of course, it's the debate between Burr, who has only that focus, and Hamilton, who has his eye on intrinsic goods. So the tendency to see everything that happens as about oneself and one's own relative status, to put it in Burr's terms, being in the room where it happens, is very narcissistic. And it's ill-suited to a society in which reciprocity and justice are important values. It loses the sense that actions have intrinsic moral worth, and that the murder of a child is bad because of the loss of the child and then the suffering it inflicts, not because of the way it affects the status of the survivors and so on. Even in the case where one is oneself a victim of crime, it somehow seems off to view murder or rape as bad because they're a down-ranking rather than because they inflict pain and trauma. If they were primarily a down-ranking, then they could be completely rectified by the humiliation of the offender. And certainly some people believe something like that. But isn't this thought actually a red herring, diverting us from the reality of death and the pain of the survivors? So, to put my radical claim succinctly, when anger makes sense, its retaliatory tendency is normatively problematic because it's focused narrowly on status. When it's normatively reasonable, focused on the murder or the rape or whatever, its retaliatory tendency doesn't make sense, and it's normatively problematic in that way. In a rational person, anger, realizing that, soon laughs at itself and goes away. From now on, I'll call this healthy segue into constructive forward-looking thoughts, and accordingly, from anger into compassionate hope and work, the transition with a capital T. So that's kind of a technical term in my project. But to clarify further what I mean by the transition, let me consider a case where it takes a political form, thereby already embarking on our search to understand revolutionary justice. And I want to look at just one case, the sequence of emotions in Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, King begins, indeed, with what looks like a summons to anger. He points to the wrongful injuries of racism, which have failed to fulfill the nation's implicit promises of racial equality. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he says, quote, "The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination." The next move King makes is highly significant, for instead of demonizing white Americans or portraying their behavior in terms apt to elicit murderous rage, he calmly compares them to people who have defaulted on a financial obligation. Quote, "America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds," end quote. So here, I think, begins the transition, for it makes us think ahead in non-retributive ways. The essential question is not how whites can be killed or humiliated, but how can a debt be made good? And in the financial metaphor, the thought of destroying the debtor is not likely to be central. The transition then gets underway in earnest, as King focuses on a future in which all may join together in pursuing justice and honoring obligations. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. No mention, again, of torment or payback, only of determination to ensure the protection of civil rights at last. King reminds the audience that the moment is urgent and that on this hot August day there's a danger of rage spilling over, but he repudiates that behavior in advance. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. And that term is a term of Gandhi's that he's appropriated. So, the payback is reconceived as the vindication of civil rights, a process that unites black and white in a quest for freedom and justice. Everyone will benefit, says King, as many white people already recognize, quote, their freedom is inextricably bound up with our freedom. King next repudiates a despair that could either lead to violence or to the abandonment of effort. And it's at this point that the most famous section of the speech, the I have a dream part, takes flight. And of course, this dream is not one of torment or payback. It's not drawn from the book of Revelation, but rather it's the prophetic dream from, let's say, the book of Isaiah of equality, liberty, and brotherhood. In pointed terms, King invites the African American members of his audience to imagine brotherhood even with their former oppressors. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words interposition and nullification, one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. Now, there is indeed the material for anger in this speech, and the speech summons up a vision of rectification which initially might seem to take a retributive form. But King gets busy right away reshaping retributivism into work and hope for how sanely and really could injustice be made good by retributive payback. The oppressor's pain and lowering do not make the afflicted free. Only an intelligent and imaginative effort toward justice can do that. So that's what I mean by the transition, a movement from anger with all its defects to forward-looking, constructive thought and work. Now, King, of course, favored nonviolence. So have many intelligent leaders. Sometimes, however, that strategy fails. Nelson Mandela records the gradual decision of the ANC under his leadership that violent strategies must be pursued in a limited way. But notice that while urging ANC members to even be motivated by anger in some ways and to engage in certain limited sorts of violent guerrilla tactics, Mandela never failed to point to the transition, pointing people forward to a future of cooperation rather than payback. And I'm going to come back to that much more in the end of the lecture. But first, it's here that I want to introduce a major exception to my own thesis that anger always involves conceptually a thought of retribution or payback. Now, I think there are very many cases, and maybe more than we would acknowledge to ourselves, in which one gets standardly angry first, thinking about payback, and then maybe in a cooler moment heads for the transition. But there are some cases in which one is there already. The entire content of one's emotion is, how outrageous, something must be done about that. So in other words, it's headed forward already. So let me call this emotion transition anger, because it is anger or a borderline species of anger, but already heading down the third fork in Angela's road. Transition anger does not focus on status, nor does it even briefly want the suffering of the offender as though it were a payback for the injury. It never gets involved at all in that type of magical thinking. It focuses on future welfare from the start. Saying something had better be done about that, it commits itself to a search for strategies, but it remains so far an open question whether and how the suffering of the offender will be among the most appealing. This sort of anger is very often felt by parents toward their children. So the child does something really outrageous, the parent is outraged, but the parents don't really want to pay the child back pain for pain. They're really focused on the future, and they want to make the child's future as good as it can be. So that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about, and it does exist in adult relationships too, only maybe not as often as we like to think. So what good could we say about garden variety anger with all of its baggage? Anger, I think, has a very limited but real utility, which derives very likely from its evolutionary role as a fight or flight mechanism. And I think it could play three instrumental roles. First of all, anger can be a useful signal to oneself, a kind of wake-up call that something is badly wrong. Still, it may not be the most accurate kind of signal, given the close connection anger has to status. In other words, you might be noticing that you're dissed and not that something is really, really wrong. Second, anger can sometimes motivate real people to address real problems. And that, I think, is probably the best thing that one can say for it. Again, however, it may not be the most reliable motivation. King did grant that people would only come out of their anomie and their inactivity to his movement if they were motivated by anger. But when they would get there, it had to be changed. He would say that the anger has to be purified, channelized. So he used the highly formal structure of the nonviolent protest march to channel real anger into something that would actually prove governable and useful. Third, anger may be a useful deterrent. People refrain from transgressing against other people when they think that an angry outburst is the result. Well, I think this may be true sometimes, but probably not a very good way to relate to other people in society, scaring them from treating you badly by being explosion-prone and slightly scary. We all know people like this, but they may simply achieve isolation and not the good treatment that they wish. More generally, the way anger deters is not likely to lead to a future of peace. Instead, it's all too likely to lead to a more devious aggression. In any case, we may retain these limited instrumental roles for anger while still insisting that its payback fantasy is profoundly misleading, and that to the extent that it does make sense, as it does in the case of relative status, it does so against the background of diseased values. The emotion, in consequence, is highly likely to lead us astray. What's the upshot for politics and law? In my larger project, I ask first about everyday criminal justice and then about revolutionary justice. As far as everyday justice goes, the upshot is precisely what Jeremy Bentham and Plato before him thought, namely the constructive forward-looking thought about how to deal with the whole social problem of crime is what should interest us, not the empty fantasy of payback. Punishment, if we end up using it, ought to compete for our attention with other strategies for preventing crime ex ante. And thus the debate that's often called the debate about the justification of punishment really ought to be a much broader debate about how punishment at all measures up to other strategies a society can use to tackle the problem of crime by approaching it before it happens. As Bentham emphasized, preventing wrongful acts is a complicated task, and we need to consider it in the broadest possible way, asking how nutrition, social welfare, inspiration, education, employment opportunities, and a variety of constructive policies may contribute. He argued that the focus on punishment ex post is actually quite inefficient if what one really wants is less crime. Often, he said, the same result can be attained, quote, as effectually at a cheaper rate, by instruction, for instance, as well as by terror, by informing the understanding, as well as by exercising an immediate influence on the will, end quote. And I think we should agree with Bentham that the failure of societies, and especially perhaps our own, to consider punishment in the context of that larger inquiry is a grotesque failure. It's as if parents stopped thinking about education, nutrition, inspiration, love, to focus single-mindedly on harsh treatment of the bad behavior that would surely follow such neglect. Parents don't often behave that way because they love their children and they think of the child's well-being as part of the parent's own. Unfortunately, citizens do not always love their fellow citizens or think of their well-being as part of the dominant group's own, and that, I fear, is why modern societies, and our own in particular, have been willing to tolerate. I pile on the misery strategy as if it really made sense. Well, there's a lot more to be said about that, but no time here. Let me then conclude with transitional justice, or rather return to that topic, since with King we're there already. Philosophers and non-philosophers alike have often seen anger as appropriate in situations of great oppression and as linked to the vindication of self-respect. It is then not surprising that non-anger in such situations should have struck many onlookers as strange, unmanly, even revolting. Consider the reaction of Webb Miller, that UPI correspondent who reported the nonviolent protest action organized by Mohandas Gandhi at the Dharasana Salt Works in 1930. This, if you've seen the excellent Attenborough Gandhi movie, this is the part played by Martin Sheen, and so this is the guy. And Miller observed scores of marchers getting beaten down by the British police 4 by 4 all day long, and he reacted with perplexity, as he records in a later memoir. Not one of the marchers even raised an arm to fend off the blows. They went down like 10 pins. From where I stood, I heard the sickening whacks of the clubs on unprotected skulls. At times, the spectacle of unresisting men being methodically bashed into a bloody pulp sickened me so much that I had to turn away. The Western mind finds it difficult to grasp the idea of non-resistance. I felt an indefinable sense of helpless rage and loathing, almost as much against the men who were submitting unresistingly to being beaten as against the police wielding the clubs. And this despite the fact that when I came to India, I sympathized with the Gandhi cause. Well, the marchers were not acquiescing. Miller should certainly have been able to see that. Their march was a demand and a protest. They continued to march, and they chanted the slogan, "Long live the revolution." And yet, as Miller says, there is something in the mind, and not only the Western mind, because in 1948, Gandhi was assassinated at point-blank range by a Hindu right-wing fanatic who, at his sentencing hearing, he gave a 150-page statement of why he did it, and it was essentially this reason that Gandhi had emasculated the Hindu male. So there's something in the mind that resists accepting this way of reacting to brutal behavior. What do Gandhi and King have to say to people who think that anger is the right response to oppressive behavior and the only response consistent with manly self-respect? First, they point out that the stance they recommend is anything but passive. Now, Gandhi, early on, he didn't know English pretty much at all, and he allowed people to use the words passive resistance in English translations of his Gujarati texts. But by 1910, he had already understood that that was a mistake, and he'd corrected it. So it didn't carry on to the period we're talking about. And he and King continually insist that what they recommend is a state of mind that is highly active and, even in King's words, dynamically aggressive, in that it involves resistance against unjust conditions and protest against them. But when I say we should not resent, I do not say that we should acquiesce, says Gandhi. King similarly says, I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. Both men hold, as I do, that anger is inherently wedded to a payback mentality. Gandhi says that resenting means wishing some harm to the aggressor, if only through divine agency. King similarly speaks of a strike-back tendency. And so that's what they want to get rid of, and what we'll soon see with what they're going to replace it. Moreover, this new attitude is not just internally active, it issues in concrete actions with one's body, actions that require considerable courage. King calls this direct action, action in which, after what he calls self-purification, and that is the rejection of ordinary anger, one's own body is used to make the case. This action is a forceful and uncompromising demand for freedom. The protester acts by marching, by breaking an unjust law in a deliberate demand for justice, by refusing to cooperate with illegitimate authority. The goal, in King's case, to force negotiation and move toward legal and political change. For Gandhi, it's no less than to get the British out of India, to overthrow a wrongful government. The idea of acquiescence in brutality is apparently what revolted Webb Miller, but he misunderstood. There's no acquiescence. There's a courageous struggle for a radical end. And what's the new attitude with which they propose to replace anger? King, as I've said, allows initial scope for real anger, allowing that it could bring people to the movement, but nonetheless, they have to soon turn to the future with hope and with faith in the possibility of justice. Meanwhile, anger toward opponents is to be transformed into a mental attitude that carefully separates the deed from the doer, criticizing and repudiating the bad deed, but not imputing unalterable evil to people. Deeds may be denounced. People always deserve respect and sympathy. After all, the ultimate goal is, in King's words, to create a world where men and women can live together. As simple as that. And that goal needs the participation of all. Above all, then, one must not seek to humiliate opponents in any way or wish them ill, but instead should seek to win their friendship and cooperation. Gandhi remarks that early in his career, he already felt very odd being asked to sing the second stanza in God Save the Queen, which asks God, scatter her enemies and make them fall, confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks. How, he says, could we assume that these opponents are knavish? Surely the believer in non-anger should not encourage such attitudes. The opponent is a person who has made a big mistake, but we hope that he can be won over by friendship and generosity. But since Mandela plays, in any case, a central role in my book, and what I find particularly valuable about Mandela is that he arrives at similar conclusions on the basis of his experience as a leader without any particular theoretical or metaphysical backing, the way Gandhi and King both turn to religious texts. And since we're in the Mandela Auditorium, let me turn to that example. So I've argued then that anger leads down two paths, each of which has an unattractive error built into it. Either anger's wish for ill to befall the wrongdoer is pointless, since payback does no good for the important parts of flourishing that have been damaged, or it remains focused on relative status, in which case it may possibly succeed in its aim, relative abasement, but that aim itself is singularly unworthy. So I'm now going to argue that Mandela instinctively comes to the same conclusion in a way informed by his study of Gandhi, but much more shaped by his own life experience and his long enforced period of self-examination during his 27 years in prison, a time that he says was extremely productive in meditating about anger. And actually, we now know something else of interest, namely, there's now evidence that there was a manuscript of the Stoic thinker Marcus Aurelius in the prison on Robben Island, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, clearly important to Mandela later, but we now know that he read them at that time. So what did Mandela realize in those long hours of what he calls Conversations with Myself, the title of a book of interviews and letters in which he explicitly alludes to Marcus Aurelius? Well, first, he says, he recognized that obsession with status is ubiquitous but unworthy. And so he refuses to go down that road, although he uses his understanding of that error to help him relate to others. As for the wish for payback, he understands it very well, he says, and feels it very deeply in his own life. But he recognized, he tells us, that payback simply doesn't accomplish anything. Maybe at some level there's a choice between anger and non-anger in the sense that wrongdoing might understandably and humanly prompt either response. But if we ponder the sheer futility of the payback wish, and if we actually want good for ourselves and other people, we quickly discover that non-anger and a generous disposition are far more useful. Above all, says Mandela, they are much more useful for the person who's the fiduciary of a nation. To put it in a nutshell, a responsible leader has to be a pragmatist. And anger is incompatible with forward-looking pragmatism. It just gets in the way. So a good leader must move to what I've called the transition as rapidly as possible, and perhaps for much of his life, just stay there. A good summary of Mandela's approach is in a little parable that he told to his interviewer, Richard Stengel, and he said it was one that he often used with his followers. I told the incident of an argument between the sun and the wind, that the sun said, "I'm stronger than you are," and the wind said, "No, I'm stronger than you are." And they decided, therefore, to test their strength with a traveler who was wearing a blanket. And they agreed that the one who would succeed in getting the traveler to get rid of his blanket would be the stronger. So the wind started. It started blowing, and the harder it blew, the tighter the traveler pulled the blanket around his body. And the wind blew and blew, but it could not get him to discard the blanket. And as I said, the harder the wind blew, the tighter the visitor tried to hold the blanket around his body. And the wind eventually gave up. Then the sun started with its rays, very mild, and they increased in intensity, and as they increased, the traveler felt the blanket was unnecessary, because the blanket is for warmth. And so he decided to relax it, to loosen it, but the rays of the sun became stronger and stronger, and eventually he threw it away. So, by a gentle method, it was possible to get the traveler to discard his blanket, and this is the parable, that through peace you will be able to convert, you see, the most determined people, and this is the method we should follow. Significantly, Mandela frames the entire question in forward-looking pragmatic terms as one of getting the other party to do what you want. He then shows that this task is much more feasible if you can get the other party to work with you rather than against you. Progress is impeded by the other party's defensiveness and anxious self-protection. Anger, consequently, does nothing to move matters forward. It just increases the other party's self-defensiveness. A gentle approach, by contrast, can gradually weaken defenses until the whole idea of self-defense is given up. Mandela, of course, was not naive, and he was not so ideological as to fail to see reality. So we would never find him proposing, as I'm afraid Gandhi did, to drop armed resistance to Hitler or to try converting Hitler by charm. His parable is offered in a particular context, that of the ending of a sometimes violent liberation struggle, with people on the other side, many of whom are genuine patriots wanting the future good of the nation. He insisted from the start of his career that nonviolence should be used only strategically. Still, behind the strategic resort to violence even was always a view of people that was transitional, focused not on payback, but on the creation of a shared future in the wake of outrageous and terrible deeds. Two famous examples show Mandela checking the demands of his own ANC comrades for payback in the service of reconciliation. The first is one you may know because it's the example of the national rugby team that is told in the wonderful movie Invictus, where Morgan Freeman plays Mandela, and that's in turn based on a book that has even more material in it by John Carlin. So the story is the ANC had voted to decertify the national rugby team as an official team of the nation to punish the racist white rugby community, because the fans really were pretty racist and rugby had been a pretty much exclusively white sport. Mandela understood the strategic importance of sports for national reconciliation, and he set out to form a friendship with the team's captain and the other players, in the process also getting them to offer rugby clinics in the townships, and therefore quickly rugby became a far less exclusively white sport. The celebration of the World Cup victory was the culmination of this long strategic campaign, and when the huge crowd in the stadium, even before the match began, so before they could know whether they would defeat New Zealand, in unison chanted, "Mandela, Mandela, Mandela," black and white together, the future of the nation was one big step further on. The second related example was that of the national anthem. The ANC had voted to substitute their freedom hymn, Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, for the old Afrikaans national anthem, Die Stem. Now Mandela, who, by the way, became fluent in Afrikaans because he found that politically valuable, he saw that this would impede a future of reconciliation. So he proposed and got his party to accept the version that is actually sung, in which the two anthems are put together. So first you have Nkosi sung in 4 different African languages, then the middle stanza is Die Stem in Afrikaans, then there's a final stanza in English. The English is kind of the language that, at least in the academy when liberal arts courses are offered, that's the language that brings black students and white students together. So anyway, that's what knits the two together. Now, in both of these cases, payback was very natural and very easy. Mandela preferred a more devious and difficult course. Although the ANC thought that their self-respect required payback, they later saw that a generous spirit was both self-respecting and far more useful for the nation. Let me end this lecture with just one more Mandela story, which shows him renouncing both the status error and the payback error. So here Mandela is talking about an interaction he had with a white Afrikaner warder or jailer who was watching him when he was in the transitional prison Victor Vorster just prior to his official release. So Mandela, during these 27 years, he was in 3 different prisons. The first was on Robben Island, and the conditions were really horrible, and that's where he spent most of the 27 years. Then, when they thought he would probably be released, he was transferred to one on the mainland called Pollsmoor, and the conditions were a little bit better. Finally, when they knew that he was going to be the president of the nation, he was about to be released, he was transferred to a country club type prison. He was still in prison, but he had a personal cook and valet, and so that's the person that we're talking about, the personal cook. And the question is how the after-dinner dishes will get done, a question in many households all over the world. So I took it upon myself to break the tension and a possible resentment on his part that he has to serve a prisoner by cooking and then washing dishes. And I offered to wash the dishes, and he refused. He said, "This is his work." I said, "No, we must share it." Although he insisted, and he was genuine, I forced him, literally forced him, to allow me to do the dishes. And we established a very good relationship. A really nice chap, Warder Svart, a very good friend of mine. It would have been so easy to see that situation as one of status inversion. The dominating Afrikaner is now doing dishes for the once despised ANC leader. It would also have been so easy to see it in terms of payback. The warder is getting some sort of pain that he deserves because of his complicity in racial oppression. Significantly, Mandela doesn't go down either of these paths even briefly. He asks only, how shall I produce cooperation and friendship? It was this remarkable capacity for generosity and reciprocity that was Mandela's genius, the fruit, as he tells us, of years of critical self-examination on Robben Island. So it's a difficult goal, but it is that goal that I'm recommending for both individuals and institutions. Anger is a prominent part of most of our lives. I've argued that it lacks the virtues often claimed for it and has both normative and practical problems all its own. I hesitate to conclude with a slogan that surely betrays my age, but it really does seem to be time to give peace a chance.
Thank you. So we're very happy to have an opportunity now to open the floor for some questions. And I want to begin by noting that Professor Nussbaum has specifically invited the first 3 questions to come from students. This is not status reduction, this is status equality.
We also
student questions.
We also ask that if you have a question, if you would walk to the end of the aisle if possible. Thank you. So we have a first question here.
Yeah, and say who you are and like what you're studying and so forth.
Thank you. My name's Alexander. I'm a junior studying history. And I would like to ask if we accept that that violence is not the inherent province of anger, how do we create a structure of violence such that it can still be used for justice but not anger?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I guess it has 2 parts, really. In the course of some sort of insurgency, you'd have to frame it one way, and then in the course of war between nations in a slightly different way. I think the standard account is not that bad, one that focuses on self-defense as the only legitimate justification for violence. And in fact, King even said that, strictly speaking, his marchers who were assailed physically could have justified violence. He just thought in their movement that was a bad tactic. But anyway, so self-defense and the just war theory revolves around the idea that it's only legitimate to the extent that it's a response to aggression of some sort. Now, the Mandela case is more complicated because there's really no legitimate government. And so what he's trying to do is to get the chance to embark upon the task of forming a government. And in that case, he has to kind of set the boundaries himself. And he set them in instrumental terms, in terms of a very specific goal that he had set out for the movement, namely to move to a racially integrated South Africa with a decent constitution and so on. And so he articulated those limits always to the people who are carrying out these guerrilla tactics. And so what that would mean is, first of all, preferring property damage to any kind of damage to persons, particularly to bystanders, and so on. So I think the law of war has worked these things out pretty carefully, and so we would turn to that first, see what we think of those limits, and then see how much of that we could apply to non-war situations within a turbulent country.
And I have a second question over here.
Hi. Hi. I wanted to ask about the way that you're characterizing.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. Oh, I'm Lauren Townsend. I'm a PhD student in philosophy here at UNC. I wanted to ask about how you're characterizing status. So it sounds a lot of times like you are thinking of something quite trivial, but when we're talking about these examples of oppression, we're talking about people who aren't even being treated with the status of being human. So it seems like that would be something quite different than if we're just worried about sort of, I don't know, a more trivial like...
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in the book you'll see, I have a long section on, I think this has stopped working. Maybe it needs, is it still working? About human dignity. That's a separate question. Why? Because it's not a zero-sum game. Everyone possesses it inalienably, and it can be fully respected for all, so it's a non-competitive good. What I'm talking about is the zero-sum game of social ranking. Now, that can take more than one form. It could be ranking in terms of wealth, ranking in terms of honor and glory, ranking in terms of manliness or something. But it's the sort of thing for which people fought duels, and because it's inherently a zero-sum game. So an affront to your honor pushes you down, and then you have to vindicate that by trying to put yourself above that person, and so on. The values involved might still be not trivial. They might involve, for example, competition for political preeminence, and so the tricky thing, and I think Hamilton is brilliant on this, the musical, is that zero-sum game is really very closely bound up with important values, such as the chance to serve your country. And there's an extremely moving letter of Hamilton where he explains why, even though he believes that dueling is the vestige of an archaic honor culture and he doesn't want to do it, why he has to accept the challenge. And he says because he is in that society, and therefore partaking in it to that extent of accepting a challenge is a necessary condition of being able to engage in politics and do good. So politics is inherently maybe competitive in some sense. So anyway, the two are hard to separate sometimes, as in that very tragic case, but the way to separate them was that Hamilton what he wanted was to build something, to create a decent and good society, and the jousting for zero-sum game honor, he felt he had to do to get that chance, but that isn't what he really wanted. So anyway, all of that is totally different from respecting human dignity, and both in the case of women who ask that their dignity be respected, and in the case of oppressed people who want recognition for their dignity, we should say that must always be respected, and it is something that all human beings possess equally, and it is inalienable, so nothing you can do can take it away, but of course laws and institutions don't always honor it and respect it, and they should. So that is a very good question, and it's a different thing.
Do we have questions from the other side of the room at all? Yep.
Hi, Nathaniel McCullum. I'm not a student, just somebody from the community. So I had a question about the role of culpability in retributive anger. It does seem to me that there is you drew a distinction earlier that there is a sort of anger that is non-retributive, and you referenced the anger that a parent might have for a child. And it seems to me, from my own personal experience as a father and as hopefully a moral thinker, that this is very often the result of culpability, right? Whether or not we view a person to be culpable for the action that they have committed. And I'm asking this specifically because it also may tie into perhaps one of the most foundational non-retributive moral statements of Western society, which is forgive them for they know not what they do.
Okay, well, culpability is important to recognize, and part of my suggestion for both personal relationships and social, political relationships is that we need to acknowledge that a wrong is a wrong. And we need to do that because otherwise relationships will become diseased. Both intimate relationships and political relationships need trust, but trust requires a framework of shared values. In a family, we need to be in agreement that this is the thing you don't do, this is wrong, and so on, and in a society too. So we need that acknowledgement. That does not mean we need payback, and you can see, as a father, I think, that to get your child to see that that was wrong is separable from inflicting proportional pain, and might be better done without that, because that just kind of confuses the lesson. And so too in the society. Now in the society, there are lots of cases, lots of different cases, and sometimes we think we can best have acknowledgement if we also have institutions that punish this person. And I think that's the usual case. If you don't punish rape and murder, then you're putting people on notice that those are not very important things. So punishment has a forward-looking function of, let's say, expressing our values, but also of specific and general deterrence. Both that person and other people would know that that's the sort of thing you don't do. So it's very like the child in that respect. And maybe we even hope that that person might be reformed. But it's not just pain for pain. It's not as though the pain nullifies or balances or cancels out the offense. No, we do it for the sake of a shared future. Now, there are times when people conclude that in that particular social context, criminal punishment might not serve the expressive ends of creating trust. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, they said that the trouble is if they charge these people with criminal offenses, they would all get high-powered lawyers because they were privileged people. And then they would lawyer up and they would never tell what they had done. So given that acknowledgement of the wrong was especially central in getting political trust to be created in that nation, they decided not to forego criminal punishment and to offer amnesty so long as they were satisfied that truth had been told. So that was that particular context. That wouldn't be what normally would happen, I think, in a functioning society. Forgiveness. Well, half the book, part of the book is about forgiveness. Now, I have a nuanced view about forgiveness. As you can see, Mandela, he never used the word forgiveness in his life. And Desmond Tutu uses it all over the place because he's a Christian priest, and so he likes that framework. But the idea of forgiveness takes off from a certain picture, and that is an angry God before whom the sinner had better quail and confess and humiliate him or herself. And that's the standard picture of forgiveness, even in philosophy. I call it transactional forgiveness, where you say, well, I'm groveling in the dirt, I say, that was bad, I won't do it again, I'm going to become a different person, and then maybe the person up above you will give you forgiveness. Now, the trouble is in human relations, I don't like it as a theology either, I have to say, but that's a separate topic. In human relations, to stand above the person and exact that penance, you grovel in the dirt or I won't give you my grace of my forgiveness. We see that happen all the time, like when these erring politicians get on TV and they say, oh, I've become a new man and now my wife has forgiven me. It's rather unseemly. I think it's a kind of displaced anger. I'll extract this performance now that I'm in the position of power. And much better, and also part of the Christian tradition, is unconditional forgiveness, where you just don't require that performance. But even then, there's sometimes a nuance of smugness or superiority to, let me give you my forgiveness, And St. Paul at one point says, give them forgiveness, for in so doing, you will heap coals of fire upon their head, which is, I'm afraid, a lot of people do see it that way. So what I'm most in favor of is just love and generosity, unconditional love. And the prodigal son and his father are my best paradigm of that, because the father runs out and with strong emotion, he simply sees his son coming and he embraces him before he knows whether the son is going to apologize and so on and so on. And in fact, we don't know why the son has decided to come back, except that he's hungry. But after the father embraces him, then of course he can tell him, well, this is not a good way to live your life, you should do this and this. But the love comes first. And I think that's how Mandela was. That's why people who would never have thought that they could change were changed so much by him. I saw on TV, watching Mandela's funeral, some young, well, not so young by that time, but some policemen remembering the presidential cavalcade where Mandela came by in his car, and he got down in front of these young police recruits, who, of course, he could have shown great suspicion toward, and he could have said, you're all complicitous in racial oppression, so you better show me that you're a new person before I'll forgive you. But nothing of that. He came over and he embraced, kissed each one on the cheek and said, our trust depends on you. And it was that preemptive generosity that won these people over completely. And this middle-aged man was in tears remembering that. So I think that's what I'm in favor of, and King, of course, also always said, you give love first. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like the person as a friend. It certainly doesn't mean you have to have a romance with the person. But it means, you extend yourself to embrace that person's humanity.
Great. We have a question over.
We don't only have Dutch students now, but we have another.
We have another question here, and two on deck, and go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Gran Muyanga. I'm a junior African Studies and Global Studies major. I am South African, so the Mandela example is quite relevant to me, and very related to the question you just answered about preemptive generosity. Do you not think it's unfair to expect perpetual preemptive generosity on the part of the oppressed? Because I think it sets up a perpetual system of people who are privileged enough to oppress to have the freedom to do so long as at some point in the future they repent. And for the sake of reconciliation, it just is pragmatic to move on in a reconciliatory manner. I think that it just sets up a stage for people who can oppress to oppress, and to come to reconciliation on their own terms, and then it's the burden of the oppressed to perhaps you're right that forgive is maybe too heavy a word, but it's the burden of the oppressed to find it within themselves to move on for pragmatism.
Well, I see what you're saying, and I think it can certainly look that way in some cases. Now, you got to remember that in both the India case and the South African case, the people who were coming to power were infinitely more numerous and powerful in numbers than the people who had oppressed them. So I actually don't think white South Africans felt, well, we have the luxury of just waiting around and we'll be just fine. I think they were terrified, actually, of what was going to happen. And as far as the British went, well, they were actually losing. They lost everything. They were getting out. They were going to have nothing. So they actually expected that they would be able to leave with their heads held high because the Indians would have behaved like savages, and then they could say, look what these savages did. And now there's some locked archives that have recently been opened that show what the British High Command was saying about Gandhi. And they were not expecting this strange behavior. They were totally flummoxed by it, because then it was the Indians who were strong and who were manly and who were powerful, and they looked like puny, ridiculous children with their clubs trying to beat a soul which they couldn't touch. So, I think that really this nonviolent behavior is certainly understandable that one could see it the other way, but I think that myself, Gandhi was quite right, that this is stronger. It is showing your strength rather than descending to the rather puerile and ridiculous level of your oppressor. I mean, these British guards, if you watch the Attenborough movie, it's actually very well done. They look like silly, undisciplined schoolboys trying to beat out of real, courageous, dignified men, to beat out of them something they couldn't touch. And it is just, the whole world saw that, and partly, of course, it was theater on Gandhi's part. But so I do think you're expressing a view that very related to the one that Malcolm X held when he criticized King, and that view is certainly comprehensible. But in the end, I think it's wrong simply because I think anger is not strong. I think it's actually weak. I think it's the behavior of children, people who haven't understood what it is to have a respectful relationship between human beings. That's what the oppressor did. But to imitate that would be, why should you do that? Why should you descend to that silly, childish level, is what I would say. But acknowledging the force of your question.
Next one is here. Thank you, Professor Nussbaum. It's such an honor for us to have you here. I really love the project and the book, and in fact, my students and I read it together this semester in a course on problems in democracy. And I'm totally on board with your conception of anger, both that it is illogical in one case, or in one set of cases, and not really normatively defensible in others. And I agree, too, that anger doesn't often seem like the right kind of position of strength. But there seems to me something that you're leaving out about anger. You've painted a really lovely picture of generosity of spirit and compassion, but anger feels really good. And I say that as a yogi and someone who sort of practices nonviolence as best I can. Don't ask my husband, but it feels good to be angry, right? And we know from scientific experimentation, from scientific experiments and psychological experiments that it serves a purpose to a certain extent of releasing something in us that needs to be released and can only be released in and through anger.
Well, actually, that cathartic view of anger, that namely you need to get it off your chest and then everything will be better, that has been actually quite not dismissed, but refuted by some of the psychological studies, like Carol Tavris, who says, well, you know, when you let it all out, usually it makes things quite a lot worse. And then you feel worse, and everyone feels worse. Now, of course, there are impulses in us, and I think anger has an evolutionary origin to some extent. Of course, it's shaped by culture, too. So the first thing I'll say is it's very shaped by culture. So if you were a Greek and Roman male, and you were inclined to let out your anger, as they often did, you would feel ashamed. You would feel diminished, because that's what your culture was telling you, that anger belonged to women and to children. And so you might be angry, but you would feel ashamed. In America, we do think, oh, it feels so good, it feels so manly, but I think that's has a lot to do with how the gendered nature of American upbringing, where little boys are encouraged to sound off and run riot and so forth. But it's the cultural part is a big part of it, of the feeling good. And no reason why we should give that as a reason for perpetuating that. But then the thing is, there are other ways of displacing it. If you're already formed in that culture such that you feel that it would really be very satisfying to be angry and you're not ashamed of that, well, what else could you do? There are lots of other things you could do to release pent-up energies that would not make your life worse, that might actually make it better. I mean, if you think about divorce litigation, so often people feel good at trying to punish the ex and in child custody settlements and punitive litigation, and they get tied up in that for years and years and years, and they never move forward. If instead they had taken up yoga or or running or some constructive way of releasing physical energy, I think then they could move forward a lot easier. So, societies have found various ways of displacing aggression. I think that's what most competitive sports are about, is displacing war-like aggression. So people, too, can do the same thing, I think, and it's usually consequences are better.
So I just want to point out, we've just crossed the 7 o'clock time, but we've already agreed we're going to go a little longer with a few more questions. and forgive us, but there will be plenty of food and drink outside for the reception.
We also
Ask for concise questions, but let's push on.
we also have quite a few people on deck at this point, folks. I don't know. Rachel, do you
I
have
have
some-
two on this side,
Okay,
at
I have
least.
one here. So we'll start here, and then we'll go to Rachel. And then
Okay.
if we can get to other people, we will. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Liam. I'm a sophomore studying English and political science. And from the beginning of this talk, you've really cultivated a sense of anger as a very sort of primal base emotion. And every sort of example, anger is the initial response. Every popular conflict involves both sides wanting to put anger at each other. And in every example, there was like a lone figure who had wisdom to show another path. So is there a way to cultivate a popular sense of transition, or is it forever dependent on a lone figure? Because otherwise, that notion sort of strikes me as anti-democratic.
Well, of course, these leaders were leaders of mass movements, so it wasn't just a loner, but Gandhi was leading millions, literally millions of Indians. But it's true that his personal presence was quite important. And it's also true, I think, with both King and Mandela, that their personal charisma and their force of their example was important. Now, I guess that is it's something I worry about. However, an example can be held in memory, and I do think the example of Dr. King has generated many similar efforts in churches all around this country. When the people in South Carolina with those terrible murders, when they responded with a kind of love and generosity, I think they were channeling, among other things, the example of Dr. King, although no doubt their pastor had a lot of influence too. So I think that what's important if these examples are started by a charismatic individual is that then the society find ways to build on that. Number one, by creating decent institutions, so then you don't need if you have civil rights, you don't need the civil rights movement, if you see what I mean. But second, by having people who follow that example. The sad, sad thing that happened with India was that Gandhi was assassinated right after independence and thereby lost the chance to shape the public culture. The other people who had divided responsibility with him, Nehru and Ambedkar, both great people. Nehru, great political leader, Ambedkar, a great legal thinker, wrote the Constitution. They were very unsuited to the task of leading public sentiments. Nehru was too elite, too remote from the people. He was a Kashmiri Brahmin. He spoke of the common people as the masses. So you can kind of see he was a Marxist who thought of the common people in purely theoretical terms. And Ambedkar was a Dalit, which was a different problem. He was from a so-called untouchable caste, and for that reason, unfortunately, the country would not have accepted him as a popular leader, and so he had that problem. I don't think he would have been a very good popular leader. But anyway, so the succession was missing, and that's the reason why today India, the whole group that planned the assassination of Gandhi, that group, the Hindu Right, is now in control of India. That group existed since about 1910, and anyway, but it's finally taken over, and there's a totally different vision. The other thing I will say is that in all of these cases, where there is a charismatic leader, that person had better make very sure that the future doesn't depend on that freedom movement with the charismatic leader. Both India and South Africa made a very similar error, which is that the movement, the Congress in the case of India, the ANC in the case of South Africa, then became a political party, but they thought it should be the only party, and the transition to multi-party democracy was never effectively accomplished in either case, with the result that in both cases, the party version of the movement became internally corrupt and sank and lost popular support. And so in the case of India, then these other terrible, terrible people have taken over. Mass murderer is the Prime Minister of India. And in the case of South Africa, well, we'll see, but it's a very bad situation. So yeah, you need to think practically about how multi-party democracy works, how to ensure a succession that doesn't just depend on that one party.
So let me say, we're going to take only a couple of more questions, but there are in your packet some question cards, right? Oh, right outside. So if you have a question, write it down and bring it or give it to us afterwards.
Okay, great.
We'll continue this also tomorrow, all morning. Okay.
And afternoon, right.
Thank you very much. I'm not a leader, but I'm a concerned citizen. And your talk is very interesting, and I do agree about with everything you said about anger. Now, you talked about Nelson Mandela as having this power of conversation to draw in the other. Those of us who live in this type of body use something called driving while black, or just living while black. Yeah. And in our interaction with, especially with law enforcement officers, you might be stopped, and the officer will stop you, and then you'll say, why did you stop me? And then the next thing is, don't ask me anything. And when you ask, why shouldn't I ask? Immediately you are arrested, and many people have even been killed, for just asking, why did you stop me? Especially given the fact that we are coming from a culture of oppression, injustice. How I, as an individual citizen, as a concerned citizen, how can I contribute to this conversation when I cannot even engage an officer who stops me when I've not done anything?
Well, yeah, of course, I totally agree with you about that. I'm from Chicago, so I know all too well all about this. Look, I think the problem is, it's always a problem how you are going to get police officers to, on the one hand, really maintain law and order and defend citizens as they should, and not overstep. And of course, in this era, and in most of our cities, racial overstepping is particularly something to which police are prone. So I would say what we can do to help is to think, write, and contribute to programs of police reform and police education. There are two people at Yale Law School, Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler, who've been writing about procedural justice and working with police departments around the country on the theory, which is so far proven pretty successful, that if young police recruits have more of an understanding of procedural justice, like through what steps do you go in order to behave decently, if that gets dinned into them in their training and it becomes second nature, then they will not behave so badly. So that can certainly help, and I think it's good that we're institutionalizing this in Chicago. It's also very good that we've got a new police captain who's from, not only African American, but from the city, not just some big shot flown in from some other place. And, we have a great deal of work to do. Our particular problem is the dilemma that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that we have a lot of crime, and we really do need people in the neighborhoods of the inner city to be safe. We want children not to be killed in drive-by shootings, so we need the police to be active and alert and to defend citizens, but then we also need them to be responsible. And it's a very hard thing to do, especially when the recruiting of police is actually, they have options. If they've got a good education, they'll probably go into the Army. If they have a less good education, they'll go into the state police. So the ones who end up being in the Chicago police are people without very good credentials, because the ones who do have good credentials have other employment opportunities. So we ought to increase recruitment by creating better conditions. So anyway, there are just a lot of things that people are talking about, and I entirely agree with you that creating a situation in which an African American friend or colleague of mine can safely drive down Lakeshore Drive, that would be a minimal, I mean, bare minimal condition of trying to create a decent society. Sure.
Okay, this is
Last one.
right over here. And remember, if you have other questions, there are cards outside for tomorrow.
So my question actually follows on this one, and the question from the philosophy student about status. I think what I'm trying to say is maybe at least one instance where one might be in praise of anger. And in my own experience, the shooting of Michael Brown and the disrespect to his body afterward provoked an immense amount of anger, I think, for a lot of people. And to cast this in terms of status and not the kind of the reference to the trivial status, it seems to me that it was really important what came out of that outflowing of individual anger, but also collective anger, was a sense that we need to diminish the power, the firepower of our police departments in light of the importance of the power of the citizen. So that was one thing. Another thought, I just have to say it, you talk about status as a not, or cultural status, social status, as not a zero-sum game. But I feel like when it comes to white privilege and that whole set of concepts, we actually are asking people who have been unduly propped up, we are asking them to be diminished, us to be diminished.
Okay, well, first of all, what my point was a kind of structural point, that it's only when you're dealing with the kind of offense that is a zero-sum game that you can get what you want by payback. So that was the point that I was making. So it's only when you see it as entirely and only about relative status that then putting the offender lower can actually give you what you want. In other cases where it's something more legitimate, such as vindication for your group's dignity that you want, you don't get that by payback. Now, second, when you say you want people to be lowered, I guess I wonder whether that's really what you mean. If you mean that you think that that inequalities in our society are too great and that we need a social floor, or maybe even a high social floor for all, and that this would mean a great deal more redistribution of wealth and income, that has nothing to do with lowering, for the simple reason that they don't own it if it's unjustly acquired. You see, John Stuart Mill made this point already, that the people, if you say we are going to redistribute wealth and income from the rich to the poor, and they're going to say, oh, our money is being taken away, Mill says, no, you don't own that money if it's needed for the just support of all. You don't own that part which you acquired at the expense of other people. So I wouldn't call it lowering. I would call it, I mean, it might be seen that way it definitely would be seen that way by people, but, paying taxes, most people, even though they don't like to pay taxes, they've got used to it by now. Now, in the era of the founding, that was a horrible thing that there would be a central bank and there would be taxes. But by now, I think most people get the idea that paying their taxes, even with a graduated tax, is fair. It's something they just ought to do. And so if we want to move it up a notch and have more redistribution, well, most European countries do have a lot more redistribution. The United States had a great deal more in the era of Nixon. If you look at the top tax rate in that era, it was really high. So I think to get people back to the era of Nixon, that would not be so impossible, right? So anyway, it's not about lowering. It's about people thinking that they should do what's right for the good of all.
So I am going to bring this to a conclusion, but we are going to continue tomorrow. Please, if you come to the program tomorrow, bring your program, the agenda. I want to thank Chancellor Folt for being